From Washington, D.C., welcome to the Harness Racing Alumni Show. I'm Freddie Hudson, and I'm here today with Trade Martin and Bob Marks.
The Harness Racing Alumni Show with your hosts, Freddie Hudson and Trade Martin.
This week's Alumni Show is brought to you by Bill Houghton, insuring standardbreds and farms for over 40 years. Bill knows the ins and outs of equine insurance. Make sure your equine investments are protected. Call or text Bill at 954-655-5547. That's 954-655-5547. Call Bill now.
Freddie, tell us about the yearlings at the sales by Hunterton Farms.
Hunterton Farms, selling their 2021 yearlings at the Lexington Select Sale, October 5th through the 9th, and the Harrisburg Sale, November 8th through the 12th. For more information, call 859-987-3983, Hunterton Farms, or email huntertonfarm@cs.com. Joining us today is International Standardbred owner and breeder, Mr. Gordon Banks. Gordon, welcome on our show.
Thanks again, Freddie.
It's always our pleasure to have you. Gordon,
always fun.
Gordon, you recently started a podcast series on social media. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I guess what triggered it was when I watched the first installment of Russell Williams' segment on HISA, because it, to be honest, it just infuriated me because it seemed such a waste of time and effort on his part, and it just seemed symptomatic of what seems to be wrong with the industry and the USTA and what's happened over the last 20 years, and sort of explained where we are. And it led me to decide to address that one podcast and then also to start over the next month maybe having 7 or 8 more on specific issues that I think are really important and could perhaps, if they were handled properly, help the industry out of the mess it's in.
Okay. What is your next podcast topic going to be?
That's a good question. I'm trying to figure out the order because I don't want them to be too negative. I'm actually thinking that the next one's just going to be sort of an outline index of the 7 or 8 topics that would follow, and maybe a quick synopsis of how I see the general picture. And then each one would follow 3 or 4 days later. And I want them to stay short, because if they're too long, they're not effective. So, 4 or 5 minutes at the most each time.
Are you going to have good haircuts for each one?
I thought different, maybe different hair colors too. I thought maybe I could do like a mohawk, but with an H for harness racing.
Okay, that sounds like a plan.
Maybe in green would be good.
What are your views on the progress of HISA?
Well, I think that HISA is in a state now where it depends completely on how things progress with the courts. But I think the administration of HISA is moving ahead on the assumption that everything will be approved. And it looks as if somewhere close to early mid-next year, as planned by the initial legislation, they would begin to put things into effect. They have a timeline they recently announced that would achieve that. And probably the only thing that would stall that would be a continuation of the case. If the case gets thrown out early, then I think they'll meet the deadlines, and I think everything will be a done deal within the next year and a half. If the case goes forward, then it would depend on how the court would look at things, if they would put a hold on HISA until there'd be a resolution from the courts. And that could delay things. But at this point in time, I think most people think that the courts are going to at least ultimately support HISA or recommend modifications that would make it okay. And that at some point in the next 2 or 3 years, HISA will be implemented.
Okay. And I'm going to move along a little bit now with the recent plea deal of Jose Navarro. Basically, he took a plea, 5 years in jail, $70K that he's going to pay at sentencing, $26 million to be paid in restitution, and after that, the possibility, after he serves his sentence, the possibility of deportation. What do you think of that deal?
I think he's hoping for deportation first.
I would think
but,
so.
It's an amazing deal, but it just shows you the amount of money that's at issue and how pervasive what he did was.
And your thoughts on that $26 million? Who do you think is going to pay for that, or is that an uncollectible fee?
I have no idea, but I would imagine if he was crooked enough to do what he did, that he probably was crooked enough to hide most of the money offshore or somewhere else. And I would think a lot of it would be pretty hard to collect. That's probably more of a message than it is something that's going to get collected in full. But who knows? Who knows how much money he took away and what he did with it? It's really a message statement.
Yeah, well, he's only earned $37 million career-wise, so it just seems like $26 million. That's like most of the purse money over the last 10 years. So
yeah, but he probably received the same amount in money for what he did in terms of drugs and supplies, and and you got to assume that a lot of the times when they were doping up various horses, there were bets involved. He could have generated a tremendous amount of money, and who knows? I mean, I still say it's more of a statement that we're going to go after people and this is serious and trying to scare away future people than it is to get all that money. But who knows?
Okay, and your thoughts on future indictments? Do you see that happening?
I hope so. I mean, the logical conclusion would be that everyone's settling their cases and spilling the beans, and I think it's necessary because you see a lot of the pretty obvious drug barns over the last 6-8 months have heated up again. I think they didn't see anything happen right after the indictments and the arrests. I think you saw a lot of the more obvious drug barns cool off for 6 or 8,
right.
10 months, and I think they've picked up again in the last 6 months, and I think a new round of arrests would be very good for the industry and would again scare the remaining ones that don't get caught off for a while.
And my last question to you, where do you see harness racing being if it continues on the same path that the leadership's taken it on, being in like 10 years from now?
Well, I think in 10 years, if leadership maintains the direction that they're going in, the industry will be so minimal that it won't be recognizable. I think the USTA has ignored the decoupling situation that developed in Florida, and instead of having put all the resources behind preventing that, the USGA should have picked up the phone, called various owners, various people that they're connected to the industry, put together a negotiating team, involved itself, and given the proper advice to the horsemen in Florida and to the industry, and prevented something that didn't have to happen. They could have gone back 10 years and done the same thing. There's been a lack of intelligent strategic leadership in the industry. And that's just one example. The off-track betting situation where the tracks make no money from what's gambled off-track is another. There's so many. If these things continue, if HISA is mishandled, and if the industry continues to try to make thoroughbreds the enemy instead of a partner, if these attitudes are allowed to continue, you're going to see a disaster in 10 years. Hopefully Jeff Grau will be around for a long time. But when Jeff Grau's not here, it's pretty hard to picture that the Meadowlands, that Vernon, that Tioga are going to continue. Now that you have Florida decoupled, as long as racetracks don't make money, how can one possibly think that in 10 years other states aren't going to follow suit and be pressured by casino interests to maximize the profits from the casinos, to use those monies for social causes, not for racing, and ultimately that most of these tracks that lose money would be gone. And that's the likely scenario, unless there's a complete change of leadership attitude and approach today. I give an example. I just watched last night Russell Williams' second podcast, and it was short, which was good, but it was basically making the point that optics are unimportant and that science is the determinant factor. That demonstrates the real problem that he and the USTA has. Optics are central to everything. in any business, in life, in friendships, in romance, in everything. And to disparage optics is to demonstrate that there's no big picture leadership. It's just a big mistake. Everyone tends to agree that it's better for the industry to have Lasix. It's better for the thoroughbred industry as well. If the small tracks in thoroughbred racing don't have Lasix, they're out of business, just as much of harness racing would be. So ultimately, there's going to be an alliance of interest that is going to work in the favor of maintaining Lasix. The other issue is that Lasix, under the HISA format, is probably going to be taken away for 2-year-olds in a relatively quick manner, which is probably a good thing. It may get phased into 3-year-olds or stake racing, which is not a terrible thing. But in terms of aged horses, it wouldn't come into play for a minimum of 3 or 4 years, and only after a 3-year study. And at that point in time, there's no reason, if things are played properly, to think that the thoroughbred industry won't be for the maintenance of Lasix to a certain extent, because they'll need it for their smaller tracks too. So instead of making everybody an enemy, we should be working with the thoroughbred industry. We should be behind the scenes communicating with everybody, and we should be communicating with HISA, which we can't do because of the lawsuit, and trying to convince all the relevant parties that the Lasix study is important, that it should be started sooner rather than later, and make certain that we have input as to the exact specifics and protocols of that Lasix study. And none of that's being done. It'll be a disaster if management isn't changed.
Agreed. And, going back to something that you said, like, now you and Eric Cherry were the underbidders on Pompano Park. Is that correct?
Yes. If we had succeeded, then we'd be the ones being yelled at.
Yeah, but I think if you succeeded, I think racing would still be continuing in Pompano.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think it would have been decoupled, because you guys would have been in support of the sport.
Yeah, we would have.
The trade, Bob, you guys have anything to add?
I want to hear Gordon's podcast. I'm sure it's very good. He's a good talker, and I enjoyed listening to you, Gordon.
Thank you. The podcast is bad because it shows my face.
It's a video also, huh?
Yes, I did a video. I might even, I don't know, I might even do another one tonight, or I'll still do it tomorrow. But I wanted to space it for the benefit of everyone out at least a week. There's only so much that anybody can take.
I got a question.
Bob?
Gordon, have you been following the appeal of the Meadowlands pace?
No, not technically since 2 or 3 days after it happened. I haven't been paying attention to what's happened since that.
Basically, Art Gray, who I understand, was a presiding judge, and he said something to the effect of the guys, they did talk to them, but yet they were kind of like vague. And I was just curious how that will actually play out, assuming it ever comes to a court of law, because I would think that at some point somebody has to ask Brett Miller what precisely did happen. And I think you would have to ask him that, under oath. And then I think you would have to ask Yana Gingras, did you or did you not yell, which may or may not have caused the situation.
I guess so.
That.
I haven't followed it. I'm probably wrong. I find it hard to believe that would get overturned in court, that decision. I don't think originally when these questions came up 2 or 3 years ago, I guess, in the Hambo, my first impression was that judges should speak with the drivers after. But then I listened to what a lot of the drivers said, and I thought that there was some merit in what they were saying, which is that it's not necessary and perhaps not relevant, and that one has to sort of go on what one sees. I don't know. I think it's a hard call to take a horse down. I mean, it's a hard call to take a horse down that didn't, in particular, break stride. It was rough-gated. From my experience, drivers yell and scream all the time. The horse was parked first over in wicked fractions for a long way. It's been known to be rough-gated and have gating issues. And so, to me, if a driver is sitting behind that horse the whole way in a $700,000 race, I would tend to think that you got to move out from that spot sooner for the protection of your own horse, so that if something weird does happen, you're not going to be surprised or caught. So my sympathy is a little bit in not changing the decision, but I really don't know. I haven't followed it, but I don't think it's going to get overturned. You think it's going to get overturned?
I don't know. I was just curious as to what exactly is going to happen, because unfortunately, whoever covers the sport has not really been very
active in it,
accurate in telling us what the appeal or what the New Jersey Racing Commission actually, have received. So
but
I
the
don't
other
really
thing
know.
is, but Bob, if you were a judge, or if it were a jury, which it probably wouldn't be, you even in a commission, you have to take with a grain of salt what the under oath testimony would be from the various drivers. I mean, if Yannick screamed, how he's in a difficult spot. He doesn't want to say anything that's going to hurt his connections. Brett Miller's going to want to say things in a way that makes it less likely that he's at fault. I think that kind of testimony can't be given a tremendous amount of weight. And then if you say, okay, well, one can speak to the other drivers and see what they say, do they corroborate things? Again, you have friendships, you have all sorts of other factors. I think that kind of testimony has to be minimal in terms of power compared to what you just see.
Under the circumstances where these guys are all friends and where they travel together on the same plane, I can well understand that.
Yeah, I think that's sadly the way it is now.
You're not likely to get a candid answer, probably not.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's just the way it is today. They fly everywhere together. They live close to each other. It's hard to think that testimony is going to be crucial there.
If you're buying or selling your home, Joe Rico is your go-to guy. Joe has been representing buyers and sellers on Long Island for 30 years. He is an expert in all types of sales. Don't settle for average. Call or text Joe Rico today at 516-524-4870. That's Joe Rico at 516-524-4870.
Freddie, why don't you give everyone his email address?
That's Joe Rico, C21@yahoo.com. Well, with that, I'm going to close the show out. Gordon, thank you so much for being on the show. We always love having you as a guest, and you're welcome back anytime that you like. And I do know that you had some of the Australian people that you wanted to bring on the show, and you actually wanted to be a guest host on the show. We'll set that up for you.
Yeah, I look forward to that, and it really is a pleasure every time I'm on. Thanks again.
That's a wrap for this week's broadcast of the Harness Racing Alumni Show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to tune in next week.
The Harness Racing Alumni Show,